Now, as we begin this conversation, it's important to keep in mind the specific context that are related to the nature of the commandments as a whole. Keep in mind that all of the commandments that we have in the Bible arise from the very nature and character of God Himself. And so therefore, whenever we try to obey them, one of our key motives is trying to be like the Lord Himself in all that we do. Now, when we think about the 9th commandment in particular, and it tells us not to bear false witness against our neighbor, in a broad sense, this means that we should be people who are trying to honor truth. And keep in mind, when Jesus in the New Testament speaks to this language of truth, He says in John 14:6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but through me." So truth is not an abstract concept. Truth is a person. And as we try to be Christ followers in our discipleship, then we're trying to understand how we can become more and more like Christ in all that we say and all that we do and all that we act. We want to be truthful like Christ Himself is truthful. So now as we apply the commandment itself in Exodus 20:16, the language here, it's good to keep the context in mind. The language says not to bear false witness against one's neighbor. So in the most narrow or the most direct sense, what this means is that we should always be telling the truth, but particularly in a legal context, that is, that we would give legal testimony that's truthful. But again, in a broader sense, there would be a sense in which God desires for us to be truthful about His Word, about people, and about the world that we live in. So the 9th commandment is the basis by which we promote truthfulness in all that we do. Now, this idea of being a truth speaker, or being the kind of person that speaks things in truthful manner, is important to remember that we align ourselves here with truth as we align ourselves with God. The opposite of this is that if we're not truth speakers, if we're not telling truthful ideas, that we're actually aligning ourselves with Satan. We think about Proverbs chapter 12, verse 22. The Lord hates liars, but is pleased with those who keep their words. Well, the reason for this strong teaching against lying is that the disposition to lie is actually the disposition and the character traits of Satan himself, who scriptures describe in John chapter 8, verses 44, as a liar, as a deceiver, and the father of liars. On the other hand, when we align ourselves with truth, our disposition is aligning with the person of God. So this then raises lots of questions in ethics, particularly in relation to the question is, must we always tell the truth? Well, the fact that God Himself is truth means that we should probably align ourselves with His nature. But some take this to mean that our comments should always be completely factual, that we should never say something that does not at least align with true facts about persons, about things, about events, or about opinions. And this raises the question of what exactly is a lie. So a lie is not necessarily defined as an untrue statement. Let me highlight this for you for a second. A person could say something that's untrue, but not have a malicious intent to it. So what we would say in that case is that they've made a mistake or that they're misinformed, but we would not necessarily call them a liar. Thus, in order for something to move away from being simply untrue and actually becoming a lie, it would need to be contrary to fact and also coupled with a bad intent on the person's part who's telling the information. Whereas a mistake can be described as wrong, we usually use the language of a lie being evil or wicked, either because it carries a moral component of bad intent and a design to hurt somebody, or it attempts to do something for the right reason, but is doing it in a way that directly opposes God's nature and His other clear commands. So the point from this is that right desires alone does not make any action permissible. Similarly with lying, one might have the right desire to be kind, to be protecting, to be compassionate, etc. That might be the reason behind someone wants to tell a lie, but that doesn't make the lying itself excusable. This is especially true in light of the fact that God Himself is truth and He cannot lie. So, does this then mean that all non-factual statements are a lie? Well, not necessarily. So, for example, Jesus Himself told parables, and even though the parables are not based on historical facts, we would not call them lying or deception. Similarly, you can take a fiction story like The Lord of the Rings or The Chronicles of Narnia, and while these are not factually based in actual history, we don't call those lies. They would only be considered lies if the author was presenting them as a way that they were true and was actually trying to deceive us. So likewise, in everyday speech, we use phrases like, man, it took me forever to get here. Now, we wouldn't call that a lie, even though it's not factually true, because the context of our speech and our language and our culture allow for some of those kinds of exaggerations. Again, in games like sports, we oftentimes play a sport where we've agreed on rules of context ahead of time where deception is allowable. And so because of all those different angles, lying is not necessarily a non-factual statement. So what is lying? Well, Christian ethicist and professor John Frame offers a helpful definition that gets us down the road some in our understanding of this discussion of what is a lie. Frame says that a lie is a word or act that intentionally deceives a neighbor in order to hurt him. So here, Frame is emphasizing that the word or act is said in opposition to the neighbor. Or if we were to use the language from the Ninth Commandment, it's bearing false witness against our neighbor. Now, not all agree with this definition of Frame. Indeed, I have some of my own reservations about it. But it's a helpful starting place for us to seeing that both elements of factual accuracy as well as the intentionality are important pieces of the way that we understand truthfulness and the question of what is a lie. So then, what do we make of the question about purposeful deception? Now, there are some disagreements among theologians and ethicists in regard to when it's okay for us to give deceptive statements purposefully. Indeed, my own view differs from John Frame in this, and I'm more in line with St. Augustine or ethicist John Murray, and more in accord with the predominant view held by Reformed Christians since the Reformation. So whereas Frame and some ethicists might make the case that not every person we meet qualifies as a neighbor in the same sense and therefore deserves truthfulness. For example, you can imagine a situation where an intruder enters into your home, holds you at gunpoint and says, "Tell me where all your children are." In this case, Frame would suggest that this person doesn't have the same rights to truthfulness as somebody else might, and so to give a deceptive comment there would be permissible. The more predominant view that's been held by Augustine and the Reformed tradition would instead argue that all persons as image bearers are our neighbors who need to be treated in the same way in that sense, so that we should speak truth to them. However, in these complicated moral situations like the one I've just mentioned, an intruder breaking into your home, God does allow for us to not necessarily give all of the information, while what the information we give should be truthful. So we see examples of this in the scriptures in a couple places. For example, if you look in Joshua chapter 8, verses 3 through 8, God authorizes the Israelites to set an ambush for their enemies. Now, in this case, the strategy was not a lie so much as it was misinterpretation of the data that was present for the enemies, so that when they came to make their military move, they made the wrong choice. Likewise, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 5, the Lord tells Samuel to go and anoint David as king, and Samuel says, "But what will I do? If Saul hears this, he'll be distraught. He may even kill me." So the Lord tells Samuel to go and to make a sacrifice and leave out the information about Samuel anointing David as king. So in this context, then, we see that the Lord has actually approved a situation where not all of the truth is told, even though what is told is factual. So while there are differences in the way good, God-fearing Christian thinkers, theologians, and ethicists have thought about this whole issue of truthfulness and lying from the scriptures, and particularly related to the Ninth Commandment, while there's disagreement, we don't want to miss the larger point. God himself is truth. And all of the different ethicists and theologians agree on these points. We should therefore never be cavalier about speaking falsehoods. We should never cover our own sins by giving deceiving answers. We should never seek to advance ourselves by speaking falsehoods against any of our neighbors. Nor should we intend harm to others by our words or our deeds. All of these are examples of prideful arrogance that set us up against the nature of who God is and his character as a truthful being, and indeed as the truth. So finally, as we think about the Ninth Commandment, it's important for us to recognize that not only is the Scripture telling us here to be truth tellers and to not speak against our neighbors, but in the broadest sense of the commandment, it's also encouraging us that we should be the kind of people that are seeking to protect the reputations of our neighbors in a more positive sense. And we should do this in two ways. First, we should be careful to never distort the truth in order to hurt our neighbor. And in our world nowadays, with all of the trouble that we're having with social media and all of the lies and rumors that can be spread through through gossip, through social media. It's really important for us as Christian men to guard ourselves against the temptation to speak things that we don't know are actually factually true, especially in social media environments, because they can tear down, they can break down people. Our job is to protect a reputation. On the other hand, the second way that we should do this is whenever we have the opportunity to speak well of a brother, to see that he would advance, to put him forward in a way that honors him, that should be a part of what we think about when we think about the 9th commandment. Not only not speaking poorly about them, but also trying to build up their reputation and honor them in the way that we speak.